Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak at this amazing place today. It's going to be very hard to follow the previous act with beautiful videos and beautiful images, but I'm going to do my best to be of interest to you and provoking some imagination and so forth into what to do with our cities. So first of all, I'm a physicist, so this is not normally my audience. Nevertheless, I work a lot with architects, so we have Clara Oloris sitting there and Alfredo as well, and many of my PhD students are architects as well. So I'm going to be presenting work that I do with them, and so I hope this will be inspiring for you. Right, so what is a physicist doing here? You know, why was I invited to be speaking in such a stage and so forth? So basically, what I want to tell you today is the need to try to understand cities from the perspective of complexity science. So why is it important as we move forward, whatever discipline it is that we're doing, to think about our future, our cities as a complex system? So first of all, if we think about the main ingredients that a city has is people, right? So the most important ingredient, without people we don't have cities, is people. And when we think about these individuals living in cities, they have different ways of interacting. So not everybody interacts in the same way. And as people interact, their heterogeneity of interactions creates communities. So we see patterns being formed in our cities because of the way people are interacting. Okay, so we cannot treat everything in the same way. We have to understand how these heterogeneities lead to observed patterns that in this case are communities. And so it is for these communities, from the micro perspective of the individuals to the communities, to the cities, that we think about building our futures. And these type of interactions are not random, yes? So they are modulated very much by the form of our cities, by transport and so forth. The next bit that we can think about the main ingredients of our cities is infrastructure. So when we think about infrastructure, it's the same thing. We have different layers of infrastructure. At the moment, I'm just depicting two of them. And we cannot think about every individual level separate. We tend to build our cities sometimes without thinking about how these different layers are interacting. But as we are affecting one of the layers, for example, the street network layer, the way our underground system is going to work is going to be very different. If our underground system is not working, then we're going to have a lot of traffic, for example, in our road network. So we have to couple these systems as we advance, where people live. So in addition to coupling the different layers of infrastructure, we have to think about the individuals as we started our talk with. So these individuals interact in their neighborhood, creating communities. And these communities are going to be segregated, or they're going to be able to interact with other communities according to the layer of our city. So depending on how our infrastructural layer is put into it, is going to allow for these communities to interact. So now we have three different layers that need to be coupled together. And of course, this is a very simplistic view. We know that each of those has many different layers. And so overall, when we think about our cities, we have people, we have infrastructure, we create institutions, we create regulatory systems, and so we have this tension of bottom-up interactions that we want to create with top-down governance and regulatory systems, okay? So in this sense, we cannot think about advancing any of those layers without considering the impact of the other one. As we change the infrastructural layer, we're going to change the communities layer. As we change the way our institutions are put in our space, we're also going to change all these other ones. So overall, the main issue is how do we understand the effect of changing one layer into the other one. So we cannot think individually, we have to couple them. But of course, we haven't been able to couple all of them. We try to couple 1 and 2 together and so forth, but it's very difficult to have a full model of how all this system works. So the beauty and the difficulty at the same time of complex systems is that it is because we have all these interactions coming together that we have an emergent behavior. And it is an emergent behavior that we cannot predict. Okay? So if we know everything, for example, about an individual, we take this individual, let's say an alien, takes an individual and studies the whole anatomy and knows everything about the individual, how the individual is able to eat, how the individual is able to walk and everything, we could not predict society. We have to put all the individuals together in order to have this emergent behavior that is society. And the same you can think about life. If you know everything about a cell, you wouldn't be able to predict how the organs form and how the organs come together in order to create life. So overall, every single complex system has an emergent behavior that is nonlinear and is not predictable. So we need to think about not the individual components, but how the interactions of all these components come together in order to create the emergent behavior that we're observing. And this very much relates to this article by Anderson that was published 50 years ago in Science that said more is different, which means that you can take all these individual components and know everything about them, but when they come together, they have a nonlinear effect that is different to the one that they will have individually. So how does it relate to our cities? So when we think about the cities around the globe, we see that these cities are in very different landscapes and have many different types of resources. For example, this is in Lebanon, this is in Morocco. Here we have historical dependencies in Prague. Then we have Mumbai, in which we have a very heterogeneous way of growth. We have Hong Kong and so forth. So when we see all these different type of cities, we think about, okay, so all these cities are in constant change. So you cannot take a city and think this is the city and I'm defining a city as it is now. This city is changing and is evolving constantly. Moreover, this city is not evolving according to somebody that said, I'm going to create a city, put a seed here, and then it's going to grow in this way, and it's going to look after many years in this other way. Why? Because it changes collectively, okay? So it's not from a single decision, it changes collectively. So even though one can think about a city, and you have the example of the garden cities of how they should work and all these sort of things, it doesn't work because there is no utopia that can predict how these cities are going to change. And overall, as we were saying, we have these tensions, the top-down regulatory processes and governance and the bottom-up interactions that are most of the time the outcome of many different disruptions. So when we think about our world, as we were saying, it has many different stresses, many different type of resources where the cities are going to grow, okay? We think about our people, and our people come from many different geographies and have evolved many different cultures, okay? And when we think about our historical trajectories, how we come to be and the city comes to be where we are, it has a very strong path dependency. So looking at the beginning of cities, we see cities like this one, in the first city, so to say, in Iraq. We see this city, and if we don't know the context, you will think, why would a city exist in a place like that, in a place with no resources? Why this city doesn't exist anymore? Because it wasn't like that back in the day. This wasn't a desert, it was a fertile land. And it changes and evolves into something completely different. If we think about my home country, my city, this is Tenochtitlan, and I think Clara presented a project about this a few days ago. So this is the Venice. This is how Mexico City looked before colonization. So it was full of water, it was full of canals, and people were transporting themselves in this type of scenario. So you think about this city, and after colonization, it looks like that. And this city now has a big problem of water. There is no drinking water in Mexico. We have many problems that Clara would have explained a few days ago. So how is it, how you could have thought about a place that looked like Venice, that all of a sudden will look like that and will have problems of water? So in addition, we have this change in terms of culture, right? So this is the temples where the main city used to be, and of course it has been replaced by the main cathedral, exactly in the place where the main temple was. And so, what is it that I'm trying to say with all of these things? We have seen that cities look very different, that they have many different access to resources and tensions and stresses with respect to their environment. We know that their societies and cultures are very different. They have different historical paths and so forth. And so when thinking about complexity size, what is it that we're trying to find? We're trying to find universal patterns. So what sort of universal patterns we can think about cities if they look so different? What sort of thing, what sort of driver we can think that all of them share if they have path dependencies that are very different, if they have stresses that are very different, if they have societies that are very different. So this is one of the things that we're aiming at when we're studying cities in terms of complexity size. Somebody wants to have a go with which sort of universalities we can think about in terms of cities? Humans, yes, but the patterns that they create. One universal pattern that comes to mind when thinking about cities. So this might be a surprising one, the morphology of cities, okay? And this very much relates to the previous video that was shown. So when we think about the morphology of cities, we know that people, so we talk about the interactions between individuals that is heterogeneous, right? Which means that we interact more with some people than with others, and that creates some sort of structure. When we think about our cities, we have to trade, and we have to go from one place to another, and that also creates a sort of structure. So the paths that were important, those you can think about, pre-Roman times and then after Roman times, that those became the roads. So two places that interacted heavily and were important in the way they interacted, those became roads, okay? And roads that interacted more were closer, right? So you can think about the way cities, now we see them, very much relates to the way we could move in our city, our way of transport. So it's not the same back in the day when you needed to walk, when you have a horse and so forth, how you will be interacting between places than nowadays. And if you think about London, so being here in London, it's a good example. The roads that used to be Roman roads are still the places where most of the retail will be concentrated. So those places that were important are still important nowadays. So we see how these path dependencies are important. But the beauty about all of this is that this connectivity is fractal. So in the previous video, you created some fractals, some of them limited diffusion aggregation. I don't know whether you saw these beautiful patterns appearing in the previous video. And so when you see this, the way we create our cities is fractal. Okay? And one of the persons that actually thought about cities as fractal systems is Mike Patty, who is the founder of the place where I come from. So I come from the Center for Advanced Spatial Analysis, which is just across the road at UCL. And Mike is the founder. And he was the one proposing, at the same time as Frank Hauser, that cities actually were fractals. But when you think about fractals, you think about these beautiful things that you saw before, or something that looks more like that. So these are regular fractals that you create with a computer, so you generate it, you have an equation, and you can recreate it. And these are the fractals that you find either in nature, or in this case, the one that we created. So having a closer look of why it's interesting to think about street networks as fractals, so we can think about the sort of landscapes that we have. In this case, if you just see at this kind of contour that these rocks create, this is a fractal. If we zoom closer into those, this is also a fractal. So the way the holes are in this rock is a fractal, the way they are distributed. If we think about a forest, we see that this is a fractal. What is a fractal? So the crowns don't want to touch each other. So it is this crown shyness that make these fractal patterns in terms of the holes that you see between the trees. If you zoom, you will see that the tree is also a fractal, but in a different way. So you have the trunk, and then you have the branches that branch in a fractal way. So the way you will generate it in the computer might be more regular, but this is what nature is generated. And as you zoom even closer, you will see that the leaf is also a fractal, okay? The way you see the different veins in the leaf. And the interesting bit about this fractal is that you observe this hierarchical organization. So you see that the width is different, and this width is telling you how the nutrients are going to be transported into the leaf. So why does it look like that, this leaf? It looks like that because of the environmental conditions of the time, how the water needed to be transported. So if you take, for example, a leaf that has been fossilized, you could know the type of climate that was back in the time when this leaf was fossilized, just because of looking at the way these different veins are distributed within the leaf. Okay. When you look at your streets, they look exactly as these leaves. Okay, so you will have some important roads and some less important roads. And the beauty about all of this is that you, in a mathematical way, you can capture the importance of that. So what is the information in the same way that you have here in your leaf, kind of the amount of nutrients that can be transported, you can think about the information that is carried by this road. Okay, so how much you need to turn to go from when you navigate your space, how you're going to navigate your space, how much you need to turn from one place to another, the amount of information that you need into that would also give rise to this hierarchical way. And then, of course, when we look at a map, we have A roads, B roads, and so forth. But this type of classification more or less tells you about how you navigate your space. Okay, which is very much related to the way you look at a leaf and how you can navigate your space. So we see that by looking at these heterogeneous interactions, because you can navigate spaces faster, in a faster way, in a faster road, than one that is very windy and you have to take a longer time. So you have a hierarchical organization that emerges from your leaves and that emerges from your streets and that emerges from the way we interact with our spaces. So how can we make sense? This is something that comes from any complex system. From any complex system, a universality that is always present when we have this heterogeneous interaction is this hierarchical organization. So if we didn't create it, this hierarchical organization, if it is there, how can we extract it? Okay? So how can we look at one of these systems and extract this hierarchical organization? So this is what we're going to see in a minute, but I just want you to think about this crazy thing. I show you the tree, I show you the leaves, but if you think about your lungs, and if you think about your eyes, and if you think about your circulatory system, we are also fractals. So we are fractals generating fractals. And we are not one fractal generating another fractal saying, okay, I'm going to build now my city, and I'm going to build a street network such that I get, for example, the fractal dimension that is the golden dimension or something like that. We collectively, as fractals, created fractal cities. So this is a collective emergent behavior. It's not somebody that thought about this city, how to create it. We collectively evolve our cities as a fractal into fractal. And in addition, so why is that, right? So we think about this need to interact between places, and this heterogeneous interaction is what gave rise to that. So as I was telling you, so how we can extract this kind of hierarchical organization. So So when we think, so going back to why I'm here as a physicist, and before I collaborated with biologists looking at ant colonies, and all of this is very much connected, is because when we think about complexity science, we're thinking about this universality, how to extract patterns, how to extract universality, which all of them come from interactions. If there are no interactions, there are no patterns. Okay? And interactions are everywhere in nature. So one of those and most important ones are the ones that happen in our brain. So we have our brain creating different modules. So you have regions in your brain that have different functions, as you well know, and you can detect these different functions in many different ways. Okay, so as you stimulate different parts of the brain, you will see how these different zones, these different modules, are emerging in the brain. But one very important quality of why we're able to function and why we're able to interact between individuals and so forth is because these different modules are not isolated. So we don't have one module and then another one and then another one. If they don't interact all together, the brain doesn't work, okay? So when we think about how this happens, so for example, we can make an experiment, okay? So you have a stimulus in the brain that will allow for one region to light up. As this stimulus increases, and you can put it as a dot here, yeah? So this is the first area that lights up when a stimulus takes place. If I increase the same stimulus, the amount of stimulus, I will see another region in the brain lighting up, and now I will have two regions, okay? This green one and this red one, and I will depict them like that. Then, as I increase the stimulus, I have a new one that appears, so I have three ones. Yes, the green, the yellow, and the red one. I increase the stimulus, and now I see that, for example, these two have merged. So even though the green and the red appear first, as I increase the stimulus, the orange and the red will come together and join into one unique module. Yes? And then I have other ones that appear, and I picture there. So this is the way to read this diagram. As I'm increasing the stimulus, I see new areas of the brain appearing, but I also see areas of the brain merging into each other, okay? So the areas in the brain need to interact in order for the brain to function. So taking this example from nature, okay, in our own brains, how can I use the same methodology in order to find the hierarchies that exist in our cities or any other type of hierarchies? Any interaction will give rise to this connected network, okay? So I want to understand how this network was created. So because everything comes from these interactions, I can use the same methodology for many different systems, for our brain, for our cities, for the ants that we studied before, and so forth. So how we can think about our cities in the same way. So basically, these heterogeneities, as we were saying, we can think about the connectivity that we created in the road network, this connectivity of having to interact from one place to the next one. So if we look, for example, at the road network, I take here the example of the city. So I have the city, and then I transform this road network into a set of dots and lines being connected. And I'm going to say that the places that are closer together have a higher probability of interaction than the places that are further apart. Thinking that back in the day, this is the way things were constructed. Things, if you think about Tobler's law for geography, they will say that things that are closer together are more relevant to you than things that are further away. So thinking about our street, converting our street into a set of dots, so you have intersections are nodes, and the roads are the links. So thinking about our street network in terms of this type of diagram, how we can conceive this diagram in the same way as we saw the interactions in our brain. So we will say, okay, let us imagine that you can only pass a message in streets that are close together, okay, that have a distance less than, say 100 meters. And so we have these streets being connected, but not these ones, okay? So the ones in red are going to be connected, but not the ones in black. And then I say, okay, I'm going to allow, instead of 100 meters, I'm going to allow 200 meters. And so I have new roads that are connected that weren't connected previously, yes? And as I increase the threshold of the distance, I will have more roads being connected than the previous one. And so doing this exercise, I can recreate the same tree as was created when we looked at the brain. So for example, in this case, let us imagine that all of these are our nodes, our intersections, and here we have our interactions or our distance with respect to road network. So then you can think about how actually it doesn't have to be the street network. You can take Facebook and look at the connections of individuals and see the amount of interactions. You can take the people here and look at the amount of messages that they send into each other and think about the intensity of these messages being the link here. Yes? And in this way, you can think about what sort of structure emerges from these groups. And so in this case, for example, if we say I'm only going to be able to pass a message if the distance is less or equal than 1, I can see that nobody passes a message, or let's say a disease. Then I'm going to increase, the threshold for this disease or this message. I'm allowed to speak louder and the message might be heard louder, okay? So then I say 2. If the distance is equal to 2, then I'm allowed to pass the message. And so I have my first community that emerges, okay? So you can think about this community has a higher intensity of interaction than any other one in this very small network, okay? In this case, you can think about the center of a city in which you have a high density, then you will have here the first communities that will appear before the other ones. Then I increase the distance and I have another community appearing. So here I built my tree, so I didn't have any communities from the other ones in the previous distance. As I increase it, I have a new community, so I link these two ones into one. And I end up creating my tree in this way. Yes? I hope is this clear? Yes, let me know if you have any questions at this point. So what is the point of doing something like that? Well, it's telling you more or less the hierarchical structure in terms of which bits are more connected and becoming a community, even though in the end you're considering your whole city together, which bits are more connected than other ones, okay? If I'm going to try to pass a message, where is it that I can target this message in order to spread, how far it will spread my message? Who is connected to whom? So when I do that, if we think about our cities and we take then our intersections as our nodes and then our roads as our links, and we run this process for the whole of the UK, this is more or less what you will see. So normally in this type of processes, sorry, I don't know how to stop this thing, but it doesn't matter. I will show you the next one. So you saw some clusters, some color clusters that were appearing at the beginning, yes, until the whole thing was linked together. So this type of process is called a percolation process. And it's a process that we know very well in physics on how to study, for example, the spread of a fire in a forest. So basically, what is it that you want? You want to detect the highest connected component. So when the fire goes into a forest, you're not able to save every tree. you will not be able to save every tree. What is it that you want? You want to put the water in order to make sure that the fire won't spread into the highest level of the forest, okay? So you want to know, basically, when you're doing this type of exercise, you want to understand, let me just go back one. You want to understand where to capture the red cluster. So the colors here correspond to a ranking of these clusters. You want to avoid this red cluster to spread and cover the whole thing, okay? So because it's a phenomenon that is very well studied in physics and in many other places, then we take this example and we use it as well for our cities. We know how to understand a system in this way. And basically what you do is you follow the evolution of the largest connected component, which is the red one. And every time there is a jump, there is a transition, something happening to the system. So for example, when you think about percolation and you think about transitions, normally you have one transition. Say from water to vapor and so forth, you have one transition. Here you have a multiplicity of transitions that tells you that there is a hierarchical structure. So because you have many different jumps, this tells you that you have this hierarchical structure. So these jumps are telling us something. What is it that they're telling us? They're telling us, for example, this first transition is telling you that you have cities. And this happens around 190 meters. And where is this transition taking place? It's taking place in London. London is the largest connected component, and you have the blue and the red that merge and become one big red one. So what do you think is happening in this system? 190 meters, a transition. Between the north and the south, the river, exactly. This is the bridge, okay? Is the width of the river. Okay, and this is how you see this first transition happening and be able to interact between them. Then one other transition that you see here is telling you about regional divisions. So even though you have some mountains, the chilterns, you don't have enough in order to create this sort of thing, okay? And another transition, it's maybe something looking into the future of what will happen later on. So you have Scotland here, and then you have the rest of England and Wales. Of course, you have Snowdonia as a park. You will have natural accidents that will be separated because they are not part of how we think about the interactions within our cities. And here is not that you have a mountain, so you have here this path dependency. So this is Scotland being separated from the rest, just by looking at how we have created our morphology of the road network. And the curious thing about the first transition, one of the transitions that I show you with respect to regional divisions, is that when you look at, for example, weekly income per capita, you see a similar phenomena. So somehow you have this north-south divide effect that happens with the way we created our road network to the way wealth is distributed. So on the right-hand side, you only have the infrastructure. You only have the road network that has been there, and on the other one, you have income per capita. I think this is for an old census. I think this is 2001, but it doesn't matter. The whole idea is that you see a similar pattern appearing there. So the way our interactions have taken place is also telling you something about the socioeconomic level in these two places. Okay, so we were saying we can create our tree by putting our cities, into a mother cluster that ties them together before other cities. So when looking at this plot over here, we see if we start from the top to the bottom, we see that, for example, the first division comes from Britain being separated between England and Wales and Scotland. The next one, another one, you see this separation in terms of regions that we saw. And another one, we have cities belonging to regions. And so you can think about the idea, for example, of the Northern Powerhouse. So when the Northern Powerhouse was put in place, it's about, okay, so let us try to think about how to put together cities in the north in order to interact together and create a strong economy. If you only consider the street network, you can see that, for example, how Newcastle, where is it? Newcastle is so far away. Look how long it will take Newcastle to be together with the other cities in the north. And you know the story of what happened with the Northern Powerhouse. You know that Newcastle, back in 2015, was one of the ones that said, well, actually, this doesn't kind of work for us. And of course, what is the question that you should ask me when I put this sort of thing? What is missing in this picture when I'm talking about the connectivity of the places? So here I'm depicting the street network. What is missing here? Trains, exactly. Transport is missing, okay? So if you think about that, it's like, well, Elsa, yes, you're talking about the interaction between cities, but it's about commuting patterns. It's about how you can interact beyond walking and beyond the horse, right? So you need something more, and beyond the car, right? So you need trains, you need transport to put into that. So once maybe you put transport, it will look in a different way. Okay, and then we have the story of HS2, and I'm not going to go into any detail because this has been filmed, and I don't want to get into trouble. So if we think about then transport, if you consider transport, are you going to recover then this hierarchical structure as well? Or is it going to be erased from all of this? So if you think about transport, you can put the trains and you can put the timetables and see how things work, but you can also nowadays think about how people are really interacting into the space. So we have mobile phone data and we have all sorts of mobility data in order to know how people are really interacting into the space. And so the question is, are people interacting in the space in a way that can recover some sort of hierarchical structure? So where have you heard this idea of moving in a way that recovers the hierarchical structure? What about crystallers, right? So I'm very sorry to have to put the name of this person here, you know, because he was actually a Nazi sympathizer, but he created this central place theory that was a theory that was very important back in the day. And the whole idea of this theory is that observing the spaces, not all cities have the same size. Why is it that you have this distribution of different city sizes all around? So one of the proposals is with respect to the sort of services that you will get. In a big city, you will get a specific set of services different from the smaller ones. So the connectivity between them, thinking about the type of land uses and the connectivity was very important. So thinking about our modern cities, how we're moving into the space. This paper, which is not mine, it was José Ramasco's group, was inspired by this idea of central place theory. So could we recover this type of hierarchy? And looking at the way people are moving into the space, we actually see that it is the case. We have these hotspots, you know, and we kind of have this intuition that we move in a kind of hierarchical way in our space. So there are these hotspots in the cities that very much create this hierarchical structure. And this was in Nature Communications, and there was another very nice paper by Laura Alessandretti who looked at the way people, individuals, so actually this paper had a huge data set of mobile phone data from many different countries, and then how we move in our space in terms of the frequency to some spaces is kind of in a hierarchical way. So we have this containers kind of idea that we're going to move more frequently inside these ones, then in a different way between the containers, you know, that you can think about, you know, your neighborhood, and then you can think about this 15-minute city kind of concept, and then to other cities or beyond our own countries. So there is kind of evidence that you have this idea of hierarchical structure in the way we move into our space. Nevertheless, when we think about these things, we're moving into these spaces because this coevolution between infrastructure and land use, okay? So we don't know what's going to happen, but the way these things are going to evolve, they are linked together, our land uses and our infrastructure. So we have to think about how to couple them into this morphology that we observe in our cities. And so all of this, finally, comes into play when thinking about resilience. Yes, in the last few minutes, I'm going to talk a bit about that. So when we think about this complexity science perspective, we talk about fractals, we talk about leaves and trees and all these sort of things. And these are things that have evolved not because of optimization processes only, but because of adaptation, okay? When we think about the way we are creating things, we're not creating things in terms of adaptation. We're creating things out of optimization and greediness and so forth. So how can we shift this way of thinking in order to move towards adaptation? Moreover, even in nature, when you think about the things that have evolved, they're not the outcome. You cannot have a model that will predict, whatever we observe in nature out of, the adaptation and so forth processes. Why? Because we have shocks, okay? So you wouldn't be able to imagine how things are wiped out only pure out of Darwin's evolution, okay? We have comets, we have unexpected shocks that are happening all the time, okay? So somehow there is a bit of randomness also happening in nature. So if we think about our society, so we have these unexpected shocks such as financial crashes, epidemics, natural disasters, and also disruptive technologies. And we cannot predict, there is no way that we can create a model to predict the future of cities, okay? We cannot know how a city is going to look in 50 years' time. Okay, we cannot create a model. The only thing we can do is to create scenarios of the things that more or less we observe that might happen with respect to climate change and so forth. So this is what we try. We create scenarios in order to see how things are going to change and maybe create preventive measures for these sort of things. So overall, what is it that we have learned from all of this? That the things that survive were able to adapt. So what we can contribute, and our main aim is how we can think about creating this future, not only out of optimization processes, but out of adaptation. So how we can think about the functions in our cities and on all these different things that will be able to adapt, okay? Because we cannot predict the shocks that are going to happen. Okay, we can think, for example, in terms of technology. Okay, we have advances in AI, so we know that jobs are going to disappear and some things are going to be created. But it's very hard to foresee what exactly going to be the different disruptive technologies that are going to happen. Okay, so going back to the initial diagram that I put, but this is nicer. So what you have is that you have different layers in your city, okay? So you have the human layer, you have all these different institutional layers, and in each of them, you have a different type of dynamics, okay? So this is the most important thing. Not only these are coupled and affect each other, in addition, they evolve at a different rate, in a different type of dynamics. And together, they form an emergent phenomena. So how we can think about advancing these layers, thinking about how each thing that you're going to be changing in one of these is going to affect all the other ones, and how you're going to drive this system, thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals, okay, for example, which is something that at least we can think about driving the system towards a better solution. And the last thing that I want to tell you is that, so as I was telling you, I'm a physicist, but my main collaborators from the work that I show you today are geographers, architects, mathematicians, and even economists. So thinking about complexity science, thinking about solving, bringing a solution for our future cities cannot be thought from a single discipline. It has to come working together with people from many different disciplines, because otherwise you have a very myopic view of what the future might be. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was quite interesting. I was wondering, and I had to miss the first 15 minutes, so sorry if you mentioned it already. In the book Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake, he talks about this experiment that they did with mycelium, where they created a mold, like a petri dish, which was at the shape of Tokyo, basically. And then the mycelium sort of expanded into the shape of Tokyo Underground, the existing structure. So it seemed quite close to maybe what you were talking about, and I was wondering if you have done any. I'd be quite interested to hear if you did any studies with mycelium, and especially after you talked about adaptation, and it's like one of the fastest organisms that adapt, so maybe we can learn from that.
Yes, thank you. No, I haven't done any experiments. So the only experiments I do are computing simulations with biological organism, only with ants, but I wasn't the one, I was the biologist picking the ants and then doing the experiments. So I haven't done these experiments. But the nice thing, and I think this is very important. So I don't know whether you missed that the street networks were fractals, but this is the main thing. That when we look at nature and we look at the kind of patterns that are formed out there, so you have the leaf, for example, that ended up having this pattern because of its interaction with the environment. Okay, so according of where the resources are, how many of them there are, you're going to have a different structure emerging in your system. So the system is interacting with the leaf, in this case, creating this pattern that gives rise to this hierarchical structure. So when you think about our street network, somehow the need to interact from one place to another one because of resources, because of need of trade, because of the way we structure this thing, created also a pattern that is very similar. And it's also a fractal. So this is one of the lessons that we learn, right? So we have different and you saw as well in the video that you had before, we have different phenomena, different physics that create these sort of things, but it is interactions at the end that you end up having this type of thing. Yeah.
Thank you. Wondering if you could just say something about what you think the limits are of understanding the social as biological. As kind of patterns and fractals. What do you think the limits of that understanding are, and where they interact with, where, I guess, when other types of thinking fit in with your type of thinking, I suppose, the qualitative, for example?
Yes. So I think this is absolutely very important. So the contextualization, right? So the contextualization very much relates to the path dependencies. So the way cities, the many different cities that we saw are going to evolve, and we saw that, for example, with London, yes, that we have the Roman roads are still important ones. So we have a strong path dependency, and that's what we observe now cannot be cut off from the path dependency. So if we only observe the phenomena without bringing in the context, which is this path dependency, we lose half of the story. So when you think about the social kind of networks that you will create, is how you understand the social networks within the context and putting the context into places where you need the qualitative work in order to be able to understand that better. And that's why you need, interdisciplinary type of groups in order to understand what does it mean to be the broker in a system. So if you have two communities and these communities are at war, which is the one that you want to direct? You don't want the person that is more connected, as you will want this person in order to spread your message. But you want the one that maybe doesn't have many connections, but links to different communities, right? So putting the context into place is very, very important, and that's really critical, and it's very difficult.
Is that the gap? Sorry, you jumped to two. Sorry.
Oh.
Hi, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the lecture. I'm just wondering if these let's say, tessellation of fractals is universal to every city. Let's say, for example, a city like Manhattan, where it's a grid. Is there like an underlying fractal pattern within the generic grid? Or if not, then what would be, let's say, like a similar model for a gridded city?
Okay, so the answer is no. You don't have the same pattern everywhere. Yes, so you have more gridded cities like Chicago, for example, as opposed to London. You have Beijing, and so they look very different. So you won't have the same pattern, and you won't have the same fractal dimension. Okay, and actually, it's not a fractal; it's even more complex. It's a multifractal. What does it mean? That when you look at your city, it has a different probability of growth in different places. It's not the same as you produce with the computers. You can produce this as well, but it's not the same. It's not the same fractal, but it is a fractal, okay? Which means that if you run this experiment, in which, I didn't show you this, but you saw how the different clusters appear. And if you look at all these clusters and look at the maximum of the fractal dimension, you will find exactly the boundaries of your cities. And that is universal. So even though you do not have universality in the fractal dimension, you have universality in the maximum of the fractal dimension to have your cities. We have, we did this experiment for a few countries, so but we haven't done them for all. But we think this is the case. So there are fractals, but they don't have the same fractal dimension. Yes.
Hi, Elsa. Thank you. I wanted to ask about adaptability.
Yes.
So in biological adaptability requires a high proportion of an existing population to die in order that the proportion of less fit die in order that in multiple generations the proportion of fitness will increase. And I wonder if when you talked about the multiple layers or subsidiary systems in a system having a different pace or the capacity to evolve at a different pace, then if the environmental change is very rapid, does that lower the probability of adaptation?
That's a very difficult question, of course, and I don't think I have the answer for that. But I would think about it in terms of redundancy of the system more than how many. Instead of thinking about evolutionary terms in the Darwinian way, you think about redundancy in your system. So when we think about our systems, we think about optimization and not redundancy. We actually want to get rid of the redundancy. But in a kind of quick experiment, which is something that we did with the ants, for example, is if you have a division of labor and some of them were in charge of something and you remove those, but the other ones were not doing anything, somebody will go and do that. So the ones that you thought were lazy ants and just, expecting food and not doing anything actually serve as redundancy for your system to be able to keep working. So exactly. So thinking about adaptation, I think it's the importance of redundancy and the importance of redundancy into the functions is what should be interesting. And as I was saying, in a very quick change, we cannot predict those. We definitely cannot, and that's why we cannot build a model for the future city, how it's going to look like. But we can only have scenarios and think about how to make sure there is enough redundancy for adaptability to happen. Yes. Yes.
You want to? Okay, I'm interested, it's really interesting, thank you for your talk, but I'm having a little bit of a hard time understanding these patterns and layers. Yes, there are layers to the cities, and yes, there are patterns within it, but when you're talking about universal patterns in cities, it's almost like we're kind of dismissing the cultural values and the tendencies and the preferences, which is arguably one of the biggest makers of the city. Some cities value certain historical elements more than other cities, which kind of dismiss them at the face of certain environmental conditions. And yes, there are, of course, as you mentioned, shocks, but it's also kind of like traumas, right? It's not what happens, but it's how you make of them is what makes a certain thing a trauma. So if you're thinking of shocks as traumas to the city, it's almost like how every different city deal with a certain shock. And in the COVID-19, let's say, example, yes, we had to deal with a certain kind of isolation and quarantine, but every city got impacted and had some leftover habits that remained, that were very specific to also somehow their culture. So where does this notion like stay in your research?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. This is very important and it relates to the previous question with respect to the context. So when you think about the network, how you're going to construct the network and the type of interactions, that's where you put that part that you're talking about, okay? So when you think about the level of intervention that you're going to make, if you think in general, okay, even though, and this is the amazing thing and the beauty about this, even though we have different cultures, even though we have different constraints in terms of resources, even though we have a very different historical trajectory, political situation, and so forth, everywhere you will be able to observe these patterns of mobility as containers. Regardless of your religion, your language, your culture, whether you live here or there, you observe this. So you do have these universal patterns in absolutely all the cities that were at least the ones that were observed. So now you are talking about a very precise thing like an intervention in a community. That's where you need then to go and put the context. So what do I do with this information of the containers? If I want to put a new technology, which was very much the work that we did with Clara, so you want this technology or this vaccination to be accepted by the community, but the community is very resistant, okay? And it's not the same, it's not going to be as resistant in Germany that is going to be in Indonesia, or yes, so you will have many different contexts according to the cultural values and many different things. So then that's where the sort of intervention that you're going to make puts the context into place. How is this community connected? What is the main mechanism that makes these networks appear? But the network is going to be there. There is nowhere in the world that you're going to have people without interacting. You're going to have communities everywhere in the world. You're not going to have a homogeneous way of interacting nowhere. Yes? So you're going to have communities forming, and you're going to have a hierarchical structure in these communities forming. You're going to have somebody that might be more connected to people than other ones. So you would like to target and speak with this person in order to be able to allow the community to, for example, accept this type of technology. Yes, regardless, how you do this is when you put the context into place. But recognizing that you have these patterns that are universal, and then you can go in there and use these tools in order to identify this individual, that's something very, very powerful.
Last question. It was a great presentation, lecture. Thank you so much. I just want to follow up with the question that Mike asked, the idea of redundancy and adaptation and in relation to time. This is actually what we at MTech deal with a lot in different scales. It's quite tangible when we talk about fabrication. You have enough redundant elements. If one fails, the other one can actually take the charge. But I just want to have your perspective from the complexity science and scientific view about when we put it in the context of a city, the idea of redundancy and have enough variation in what aspects should a shock happen, the ones that were not quite suitable for the context become suitable for the future context. This redundancy, what do you imagine this could be manifested in the scale of a city? Is it going to be only manifested? Things that come to my mind as an architect and sometimes urban design is morphology. But what other things could be actually be considered like infrastructural for this redundancy to be manifested, both for the current cities that we have right now and the cities that might be actually built in future? I just wanted to know your opinion on this.
So my first reaction, for example, which is something that you saw happening, is the use of active transport. Yes, so instead of only being able to move by car or something like that, then you have another way of moving that is using the bikes and so forth. So this brings redundancy into the system, allowing you to move in many different ways and not only the one. Right? Public transport and so forth. Think about public spaces, the use of public spaces, instead of having only one function, another one. When COVID hit, you could see like everything being closed instead of being able to be used in different ways by a certain amount of individuals. So you can think about also, for example, restaurants, okay, they couldn't accept people, but then they deliver food. The ones that didn't deliver food didn't survive. So you can think about this way of functions within the city. So how we can be more creative and think outside the box in order to allow for one building to serve different purposes. And there are different communities that work like that, in which the building doesn't serve only one purpose, but serves many different purposes. And I think in the developing world, you see more innovative ideas about having uses of buildings in many different ways instead of only one. So, I mean, I'm not an architect, and I wouldn't be able to tell you how exactly. But I think this is something really interesting. So, how we can think about more adaptability, more functions into the space instead of only with one thing for one specific thing that might be obsolete. Many offices had to move places because people are not going to work every day anymore, and so hot desking is the new solution, for example. Yes.
Mike? I just want to really thank you for coming, and we'll take a short break now and rearrange the furniture a little bit, and we'll go on to our final panel discussions. Thank you, Elsa.